Picture a woman on a street, late morning, flat, ordinary light, traffic behind you. She's walking, and she's talking. Not into a phone, not to a friend beside her, but to someone the rest of us can't see. Sometimes she laughs, sometimes she argues, really argues, as if the person in front of her has just said something unbearable. Once in a while she stops, turns slightly, and answers a question no one asked out loud. She steps into a small shop and asks for a coffee. Politely, please, thank you. The man behind the counter hands it to her. She turns, still talking, and walks out without paying. People notice. A few smile in that uncomfortable way people smile when they want distance from what is happening. One person steps back. Someone gets angry. And somebody, there is always somebody, says the word under their breath. Crazy. Mad. And with that, the story is supposed to be over. Now widen the frame. 20 feet ahead, a man is talking to himself while he rehearses an argument he may never have. No one cares. A teenager with earbuds laughs at something invisible, obviously fine. A man in a suit murmurs numbers into the air, eyes fixed on nothing. Busy? Probably important. A woman in a tailored coat is arguing into a phone so small you almost miss it. Professional. Having a difficult morning. All of them are doing some version of the same thing, speaking to an absent listener, moving through public space with half their attention somewhere the rest of us can't access. Only one of them is at risk of becoming a story. It isn't the talking. It isn't even the talking to no one. It's the absence of an authorized explanation. No earbud, no suit, no badge, no performance of productivity. No small object that tells the people passing by. This strangeness belongs inside the contract. Without the prop, she is exposed. Now put a small white earbud in her ear. She isn't mad anymore. Nothing about her has changed. We still can't hear the other voice. We still don't know who she's speaking to. We still have no access to her reality. But the symbol satisfies us, and the fear drains out of the scene. We file her under normal and continue walking. That is how thin the line is. We were never judging her reality. We were checking whether she carried the right prop. The props change, the habit doesn't. A man speaking out loud on the sidewalk is unwell. The same man with a headset is an executive. A woman who hears a voice and obeys it is ill. A woman who hears a voice and calls it prayer may be devout. Even admired, depending on the room. From the outside, the posture can look almost identical. What we actually read is the packaging, the costume, the class, the authority wrapped around the act. Keep that woman in the morning light. We'll need her again. Now a second scene. A young man moves to Switzerland to study. He's trying hard. The language, the customs, the quiet pressure of wanting to belong. A new friend invites him home for a weekend dinner. He brings wine. They cook outside, a handful of people around a table, the evening warm and easy. At the end of it, the host adds up what each guest owes for the food and asks them to pay their share. In that house, in that culture, this is normal. Splitting the cost isn't an insult. It's fairness. Nobody at the table experiences it as cold or cruel. Nobody except him. He comes from a place where asking a guest for money would feel almost obscene. Hospitality means the guest is protected from the bill. To him, this isn't fairness. It's a wound. He stops speaking to his friend for weeks. He genuinely cannot understand what kind of person would invite someone into their home and then charge them for being there. Months pass before he understands that nothing cruel happened. No insult, no hidden contempt. Just a different invisible rule, running silently under an ordinary evening. Put the two scenes beside each other. A woman leaves with a coffee she didn't pay for. A host asks a guest to pay for food he was invited to eat. Two rules around money and hospitality are broken in opposite directions. Which one is mad? The trap appears as soon as the question is asked. The behaviour doesn't decide it. The act is just an act. What decides it is the contract in the heads of the people watching. The agreement nobody signed, nobody wrote down, and almost nobody can say out loud. We carry these contracts everywhere. We mistake them for reality, and we're most certain of them in the exact moments we can't see them. The contract is not only cultural, it is visual. It has class markers, gender markers, religious markers, professional markers. A person crying in a hospital corridor is in crisis. A person crying on a sidewalk is making a scene. A man pacing in a courthouse hallway is preparing a case. A man pacing in a bus station may be watched by security. The same trembling hand can be read as illness, prayer, withdrawal, grief, genius, weakness, threat, or evidence, depending on who owns the room around it. This film begins there, not with a textbook definition, not with a clinic, with a reflex, with the instant a person doesn't fit the contract, and the rest of us reach for a word that lets us stop wondering why. And from the beginning, the word she matters. When you go looking for the people history called mad, you find women at the front of the line again and again, for reasons that often had very little to do with their minds. A woman who wanted too much. A woman who said no. A woman who would not stay in the room assigned to her. A woman who argued with a priest, a husband, or a doctor, and discovered that all three could reach for the same word. The title uses she on purpose, not decoration, a trail. One boundary has to be clear before we go further. Serious suffering is real. People do break sometimes, in ways that frighten even themselves. Some need medicine, shelter, therapy, protection, time, skilled care. There is no shame in any of that. This film is not here to take that care away from anyone, but set that real, severe, clinical suffering aside with respect, and look at everything else we have swept under the same word. The vast, crowded, convenient everything else. Refusal, grief, eccentricity, anger, disobedience, sensitivity, poverty, female desire, spiritual experience, neurodivergence, exhaustion, pain that became inconvenient to the people around it. Most of that history was never simply about the mind. Maybe the history of madness isn't really the history of the mad. Maybe it is the history of the people who called themselves sane and decided who had to stand outside the door. This will not be a clean story about ignorance slowly becoming enlightenment. That would be too comforting. The story keeps changing costumes. A demon becomes a disease becomes a file becomes a form becomes a life arranged by other people. Again and again the language gets cleaner while the power underneath survives. Mad. Crazy. The words sound clinical because they borrow the shadow of the clinic. A white coat, a file, a diagnosis. But no doctor writes crazy as a formal diagnosis. Mad is not a medical term in the ordinary sense. It is a social word, and it has been doing social work for thousands of years. Sometimes it is an insult. Sometimes it is fear dressed up as description. Sometimes it is admiration we are too embarrassed to name. The artist, the rebel, the person who does what we secretly wish we could do, a little crazy. The word bends toward whatever the speaker needs it to carry. Under all its uses, it performs one function better than almost any other word in the language. It ends the conversation. The moment someone is crazy, you no longer have to follow their logic. You don't have to ask what they meant. You don't have to consider the possibility that, beneath the strange delivery, there may be an accurate complaint. The label closes the case. It relieves the listener of obligation. That is why the word is so useful. It does not simply describe a person. It rearranges the room around them. People step away. Their sentences become less credible. Their anger becomes evidence against them. Their fear becomes proof that they cannot be trusted with their own story. The word travels quickly, from mouth to file, from family conversation to doctor's note, from rumour to institutional fact. Once it enters the official record, it's often harder to remove than the things that were actually true. Calling someone mad is the most efficient method ever invented for no longer having to listen to them. The cost lands on the person being named. A word said by the right person at the right moment can take apart a life, not symbolically, literally. A home, a job, a name, children, the right to be believed, the right to leave a room when you want to. So the real question was never simply what madness is. That question gets abstract very quickly. The harder question is smaller. Who gets to decide? The person living inside the experience, the crowd across the street, the doctor who can write it down and make it official, the family who believe somewhere underneath that they own her, the husband who expected obedience and didn't get it, the school that built a particular kind of chair and blamed the child who could not sit in it, the employer who needs her productive, agreeable, and at her desk by 8. Every person in that list has something the person being judged may not have. Recognized authority, a title, a social position, the ability to make their version of events the one that gets recorded. The priest has the church, the husband had the law, for most of history quite literally. The doctor has the file, the employer has the performance review, the institution has the locked door. The person being judged is often the only one in the room without a vote. Everyone gets to define her. She gets to be defined. That asymmetry is the beginning of violence long before anyone raises a hand. A person's own account becomes suspect. Their memory is treated as unstable, their perception as contaminated, their protest as another symptom. Once that happens, almost anything can be done to them and still sound reasonable. And across most of recorded history, the people with the official power to define have been men. Men deciding which women were irrational, unstable, hysterical, disordered, unfit. Men writing the categories, running the institutions, signing the papers, listening to husbands, distrusting wives. This is not a side detail. It is close to the plot. The priest, the husband, the doctor, the state, the school, the factory floor. Each of them, in a different century, picked up the word and aimed it at someone who was too much, too different, too loud, too unwilling to agree. A pattern shows itself early and it keeps returning. The line between sane and mad often lines up suspiciously well with the line between useful and inconvenient. The people a system can manage are called normal. The people it cannot manage are called something else. Madness is very often not a diagnosis of the mind. It is a diagnosis of the order, of the rules someone somewhere refused to obey. Each time someone in this story is called mad, ask who said so. Then ask what became easier for them the moment the word left their mouth. Among the earliest things human beings wrote down, alongside kings, grain, debts, temples, and gods, there are records of minds coming apart. More than 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, on clay pressed with some of the earliest marks we can still read, there is an account of a man his community seems to have known and valued. Kind, sociable, not someone people feared. The sort of person whose presence once made sense to everyone around him. Then something changed. He became convinced the gods were about to punish him. He said a priest was walking behind him. Always behind him, just out of sight, pointing a finger at his back, furious, following him wherever he went. No one else could see this priest. That was the terror, not guilt itself. In that world, guilt had a place. If you offended a god, punishment followed. That was how reality was organized. The frightening part was the invisible accuser, the certainty locked inside one person with no witness outside him. Picture him for a moment, not as a specimen, as a person, a man who cannot sleep, a man repeating the same impossible story to anyone who will sit with him, a presence behind his shoulder, a judgment he can feel but cannot prove, a crime no one will name. If you have read Kafka, you know the shape of that nightmare. A person accused by a court he cannot find, condemned under a law he cannot read, certain of guilt and unable to learn what he did. 4,000 years before Kafka wrote it down, someone in Mesopotamia was already living inside that architecture of fear. What did the people around him do? They did not think in terms of the brain, not yet. They thought in terms of spirit, impurity, divine anger, unseen forces. A disturbance had entered him, attached itself to him, or followed him. And there were healer priests, ritual specialists, temple spaces where someone in that condition might be washed, treated with herbs and oils, spoken to, prayed over, walk through rituals meant to draw the disturbance out. Their explanation was not ours. Some of what they did would seem strange now. But the first movement was not indifference. They turned toward him. They tried to make sense of what was happening. They tried to help with the language and tools their world gave them. Read those old descriptions with modern eyes and the distance collapses. Sleeplessness, dread, the certainty of being watched, pursued, judged. A figure no one else can see. The categories have changed, but the human being is recognizable. That is one of the first lessons of this history. The strange mind isn't new. The explanations are. First gods, then spirits, then the devil, later the womb, later the brain, later a diagnostic manual revised by committees, printed in careful language placed on a clinician's shelf. Every age reaches for the strongest vocabulary it owns and gives the troubled mind that name. The Sumerians had spirits and gods. The medieval church had demons. The Victorians had nerves and wombs. We have brain chemistry, trauma frameworks, diagnostic codes, clinical language. Each vocabulary contains real insight. Each can also become a ceiling, a place where curiosity stops. The language isn't the danger by itself, certainty is. An explanation can be a mercy. It can give shape to terror. It can tell a frightened person that what is happening has happened before, that there are hands trained to help, that the night they are in has been entered and survived by others. But an explanation can also become a kind of possession. The category starts speaking louder than the person. The theory becomes cleaner than the life it claims to explain. And because the theory is cleaner, institutions often prefer it. The moment a vocabulary becomes absolute, the person disappears behind it. What remains is the category. The Mesopotamian man, terrified of the priest behind his shoulder, is lost to us except in fragments. We will never know exactly what he experienced. 4,000 years is too long for the edges to hold. But the people around him did something worth carrying into the darker rooms ahead. Before they classified him, they tried to care for him. That order matters, because a name is not harmless. A name can organize care, but it can also organize distance. It can gather people around a person, or it can give them permission to step away. It can open a door to treatment, or close the door to being believed. The difference is not in the word alone, it is in the order of the act. Care first, then a name. Somewhere along the way, again and again, we reversed it. We became so efficient at naming that the name began to replace the care. The label became the whole transaction. The door opened just long enough to file the person away, and then it closed. The next centuries will show how that reversal happened, and who was most often left on the wrong side of the door. So far, the story sounds like fear all the way down. It wasn't. There were times and places where madness was not only something to dread. Sometimes it was a gift. Sometimes it was a dangerous kind of nearness to the sacred. Step into the ancient Greek world and the air changes. Losing the ordinary mind could mean two opposite things, and the same culture could hold both at once. It could be punishment from the gods, or it could be a door, an opening into something the merely reasonable mind could not reach. Plato described divine madness as a state that was not simply illness, dangerous, yes, unstable, yes, but not automatically inferior to reason, sometimes higher, sometimes luminous. There was prophetic madness, the kind that moved through the oracle at Delphi, where speech seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond the speaker. Poetic madness, the gift of the muses without which art itself seemed impossible. Erotic madness, love taking a person apart from the inside. Mystic madness, the Dionysian kind, where the borders of the self loosened and the individual dissolved into something larger. A modern viewer has to be careful here. It would be easy to turn this into romance. Ancient people honoured what we medicate, therefore they were wiser. That is too simple, and it is not true. Ancient societies could be brutal to people who suffered. Reverence and cruelty lived very close together, but the comparison still matters. Some experiences that might now be quickly treated, managed, or pathologized were once given a place near the center of culture. Trembling, vision, strange speech, ecstasy, not always a symptom to be silenced as fast as possible. Sometimes a sign that the ordinary world had opened briefly onto another one. Even the darker myths keep the double meaning. Heracles, driven mad by the gods, kills his own family. It is horror. It is punishment. But the story doesn't end with the act. It becomes the beginning of a road back, labour, purification, a long passage through guilt and ordeal. The madness is catastrophe and threshold at once. The same intensity one age calls a sacred gift, another age calls a disease. That sentence needs care. It does not mean agony is secretly holiness, or that a person in terror should be admired instead of helped. It means meaning is never produced by the nervous system alone. It is produced in the meeting between an experience and a world prepared to interpret it. The same state can become a calling, a shame, a crime, a diagnosis, or a family secret depending on the society that receives it. Nothing about the trembling itself has to change. Nothing about the vision. What changes is the circle of people standing around it, deciding what the experience is allowed to mean, upward or downward, oracle or patient, temple or ward. That decision does not come from the state alone. It comes from the culture around the state, what it believes, what it fears, what it needs, how much room it has, and who holds the authority to interpret. This is not sealed in the past. A person who hears spirits in a culture that believes in spirits may be touched, gifted, ordinary, or assigned a role. Move that same person into a culture that trusts only the language of brains and chemistry, and the same experience may become a symptom, the same person a patient. The voice did not change. The world around the voice changed. We do this even inside a single society. The child who cannot sit still in a classroom is a problem. Put that same child outside in motion, with something real to engage, and the problem changes shape. The mind did not change. The room changed. We built a very specific kind of room. Desks, bells, rows, hours of stillness, and then called the children who could not perform inside it disordered. We will come back to that room. It was built for reasons that had very little to do with the flourishing of children whose minds moved differently. For a long time the strange mind could stand near the gods, and people listened. But the doorway was moving, out of the temple, down into the body. Madness was coming out of the sky and settling of all the places it could have settled inside the human brain. The name we hang on that shift is Hippocrates, not one man exactly, a name attached to a tradition of physicians writing across generations. But under that name, something genuinely radical happened, even if much of the theory now looks wrong. They took madness away from the gods, a fit, a tremor, a mind coming apart. These were no longer automatically sacred or cursed, sent by a god or seized by a demon. The Hippocratic writers looked at the same events and said something close to blasphemy. This comes from the body, from the brain. They said it most sharply about the so-called sacred disease, the seizures many treated as divine. It is no more sacred than any other illness, they argued. The people calling it sacred were hiding the fact that they did not understand it. When you cannot explain something and cannot cure it, the language of the gods can be a very convenient place to hide your ignorance while keeping your authority intact. That argument is more than 2,000 years old. It still has teeth. We never stopped doing the thing they named. We changed the vocabulary. Sometimes we reach for chemical imbalance with the same finality older worlds reached for gods. Not always because the explanation is false. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes medication is the difference between losing a life and getting one back. But any phrase, even a useful one, can become a wall. A place where curiosity stops. A way to avoid looking at the person, the family, the room, the job, the grief, the history, the arrangement. The vocabulary upgrades. The reflex survives. The Hippocratic explanation was the four humours. The body ran on blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and health meant balance among them. Too much black bile pulled a person into melancholy. Too much yellow bile drove rage. Too much phlegm left a person heavy and dull. Tip the fluids, tip the mind. That is not how bodies work. But the moral movement underneath mattered. Their treatments, at their best, were not exorcism and torture. Diet, rest, exercise, a walk to settle the spirit. Bleeding too, yes, and that part aged badly. Still, beneath the error was an instinct that remains humane. Mind and body belong to one system, and you tend the whole person when one part suffers. On the surface, this looks like progress. In many ways, it was. To pull madness out of demons and into the body was an act of mercy. It told the suffering person, you are not cursed, you are not possessed, you are not singled out by a furious god. Something in you is out of balance, and balance can be tended. But every act of naming creates a new authority. Once madness lives in the body, someone must claim to know what the body should be. Someone must define balance. Someone must decide when you have fallen outside it. This can save a life. A skilled clinician, listening carefully, can see danger that family members miss, name suffering that has been misread as weakness, offer medicine or care that returns someone to themselves. But the same structure also creates a peril. The expert can become the only authorized narrator. The person suffering can become raw material for interpretation, rather than a participant in it. The priest claimed to read your soul. The physician would claim to read your body, your brain, your blood. The ruler moved from the altar to the clinic. It didn't disappear. The problem was never science itself. Bad science can be corrected. The problem is who gets to hold the ruler, and who is made to stand still while being measured. Across much of the history ahead, the people defining balance weren't the people being measured against it. The person under examination rarely got to decide where the marks belonged. She received the result. She was told what she was. As long as the expert and the diagnosed person belonged to different worlds, different genders, classes, races, levels of power, diagnosis can carry a second function beyond care. It can maintain the order. It can tell the person at the bottom of the arrangement, the problem is you, not the arrangement. It can turn the structural into the personal. It can make a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation look like evidence of a broken mind. That trick is old. Medicine has performed it more times than it likes to remember. Soon the expert will not be reading the brain at all. He will be reading the womb, the marriage, the question of whether a wife has been obedient enough, the question of whether a woman's anger, desire, grief or refusal counts as a medical problem. The man who measures, the woman who is measured, that arrangement is coming. We have watched the strange mind move from gods to spirits to body, feared, then revered, then handed to experts. Now the door slams shut. The devil is coming back, and this time he needs a body to climb inside, and for much of the story ahead, that body will be female. Previous part ended with a door slamming. This is what was waiting on the other side. By the time the medieval world settled into itself, the old Hippocratic idea that madness lived in the body, in the blood, in the imbalance of invisible fluids, had not disappeared. It had simply been buried under something louder. The devil was back, and with him came a whole apparatus of explanation. Demons, possession, evil spirits inhabiting human flesh, the body as a vessel that could be taken over by forces from below. The trembling, the visions, the voice from nowhere. These were no longer only signs of imbalance or excess black bile. They were evidence of contamination, spiritual invasion, the consequences of sin. The shift isn't just theological, it's political. When madness is a medical condition, the sufferer needs tending. When madness is demonic possession, the sufferer needs purging, and the person doing the purging has enormous power over the one on the floor, the priest, the inquisitor, the exorcist. These were not simply healers. They were investigators of the soul, with permission to apply whatever pressure they believed would drive the contamination out. Think of the scene for a second. A person trembles or speaks in a voice that isn't their own, or falls to the floor, or laughs at nothing, or hears something the rest of the room can't hear. People gather. Someone sends for the priest. And then the full weight of the room, its fear, its need for explanation, its desperate wish to locate the strangeness somewhere outside itself, lands on one body. The person on the floor is no longer simply a person going through something incomprehensible. They become the site, the vessel, the battlefield. The exorcism that follows is not primarily for them. It is for the people watching. The ritual says, we can still identify evil. We can still fight it. The world is still legible, still organized, still under someone's control. The relief in the room is genuine. The person on the floor may or may not improve. The community almost always feels better. Some of the people performing these rituals meant every word of it as mercy. Most of us have an instinct to help when someone is suffering. Medieval clergy were not exempt from that. But mercy and power are dangerous when they share a bed. In this arrangement, the person suffering had no way to challenge the diagnosis, no second opinion, no appeal. The priest had spoken. That was the end of the story. Societies keep doing some version of this. When something frightens them, a plague, a drought, a harvest that fails, a child who dies, a woman who refuses, they look for an explanation that places the source of fear somewhere outside themselves. A cause, an enemy, an evil they can name and face and ideally destroy. The demon serves that purpose almost too well. It says, the wrongness is not in us, it is in them. Something got inside them, and we are the ones who can get it out. What they were really doing was putting their own fear inside another person's body, and then attacking it there. And then the logic found its most useful target. If you wanted a vessel for communal fear, if you wanted a body to carry the blame, to be visible, to be available, there was already a kind of person placed close to the edge of protection. Someone used to having her life interpreted by others, her behaviour explained away, her own account of herself overridden. The woman, the old woman especially, the one living alone, the one with knowledge that didn't come from a university, the one who healed or refused, the one who owned something or wanted something or had the wrong kind of history. The demon had found his address. The witch trials are often treated like a footnote, a strange, credulous episode from a pre-modern age, embarrassing in retrospect, mercifully over. They were not a footnote, they were a system. Between roughly 1450 and 1750, across Europe and its colonial extensions, tens of thousands of people were executed for witchcraft, often estimated somewhere between 40 and 60,000, though the figures vary by region, record quality, and method of counting. The records themselves were kept by the people doing the killing. What stays consistent across the estimates is this: the majority of those killed were women. In some regions, the proportion approached 80%. What kind of women? Old women often, poor women, widows, women who lived without the supervision of a husband or father, women who knew things, the names of plants, the timing of births, the location of pain in a body, midwives, healers, women who had property that someone else wanted, women who had refused a man, women who had been too visible, or too angry, or too independent, or simply too difficult to ignore. They didn't have to do anything demonic, they simply had to be inconvenient. Then something went wrong in the village. A harvest failed. A child stopped breathing. A man became impotent. Cattle died in the night. These things happen in every village, in every century. They happen now. But in a world without germ theory, without meteorology, without any real understanding of miscarriage or infant mortality, they happened without explanation. And a community without explanation will go looking for one. So they looked around. The woman on the edge of things was the obvious candidate. She was already slightly outside the social contract. She'd already earned unease. She didn't quite fit. She was old or unmarried or loud or strange or knowledgeable in ways that nobody had sanctioned. She lived alone. She kept herself. Maybe she argued with someone last week. Maybe she looked at a child the wrong way. That was enough. Under torture, and torture was standard, routine, considered a legitimate investigative tool, women confessed to flying, to consorting with the devil, to causing the deaths of livestock and children, to attending Sabbaths in the dark. They confessed to things that were physically impossible, because impossible confessions were what their inquisitors needed, and because once they started confessing, stopping was dangerous. The more they confessed, the more they implicated others. Names came out. Accusations spread through communities like fire through dry wood. The witch was not necessarily a woman who had done something wicked. The witch was what a society decided to call a woman it found threatening, useless, or simply too present. She became the externalization of everything the community feared in itself: lust, chaos, the body, the night, the loss of control, projected onto the woman who couldn't protect herself from the projection. The witch is the name a patriarchal society gives to a woman before medical language arrives to do the same work more politely. Call her a witch, and you burn her. Call her a hysteric, and you put her to bed, prescribe rest and silence, remove her pen and her freedom and her voice, and wait for her to become manageable. The methods differ. The logic is almost identical. She is too much. She needs to be contained. Only the language changes. The language was about to change. Cities grew. That's where this part of the story begins. Not with cruelty exactly, with ambition. With the belief that a good society was an ordered society, and that an ordered society needed to sort people into legible categories: who worked, who governed, who prayed, who was cared for, and where, and by whom. Civilization, as it developed, required administration, and administration required rooms. By the 17th century, across Western Europe, a new institution was taking shape. Not quite a hospital, not quite a prison, not quite a poorhouse. Something that borrowed from all three and was fully none of them. A place where the city could put the people it couldn't otherwise fit. The mad, yes, but also the poor, the vagrant, the criminal, the orphan, the woman who had fallen outside the categories of wife, mother, or nun. These were not separate populations, housed separately by condition. They were bundled together in the same buildings under the same administration, because what they had in common was not a shared illness. What they had in common was that they disturbed the order. That detail gives the function away. Confinement was not mainly treatment. Treatment was rarely on offer, rarely worked, and was rarely the point. Confinement was about the city's self-image. The growing cities of early modern Europe were not only economic and political projects. They were aesthetic ones. A city aspired to look legible, reasonable, commercial, productive, controlled. A city where nothing embarrassing was visible in the streets, where the poor didn't make scenes in the market, where the trembling and the shouting and the lost were moved out of view before respectable people had to step around them. The visible mad complicated the story a civilization was trying to tell about itself. They were proof that reason did not prevail, that human suffering didn't resolve into order, that not everyone could be organized into a productive place. Remove them from the public square, and you could maintain the story. Tuck them behind walls, and they stopped being a problem, at least for the city's sense of itself. The institutions that housed them were not primarily places of healing. They were the city's blind spot, made physical, funded, staffed. Walls where inconvenient things went so the convenient things could feel undisturbed and rational and clean. The asylum served something like the function of a municipal sewer. It moved what was unsightly out of sight, and the city breathed easier. Michel Foucault called this the Great Confinement, the large-scale institutional project of rounding up and housing the socially disruptive. His argument overstates it in some directions. Historians have pushed back on the scale and the coherence across different regions. But the core observation survives the pushback. The institution was not primarily organized around the welfare of the person inside it. It was organized around the comfort of the people outside. The person inside didn't matter to the institution as a person. They mattered as a category. And categories don't need to be consulted or heard or improved. They just need to be maintained. This is what institutions do to people, over time, when organized this way. They don't just house people, they make them. A person locked in a room for long enough can begin to become what the room tells her she is. Not because she is weak, because she is human. All of us build a sense of self partly from the reflection we see in the faces around us. When those faces are frightened, cold, clinical, or simply indifferent, when no one asks your name, or treats your history as something worth knowing, or speaks to you as though your future is a real thing, the self begins to contract. Not immediately, slowly, over years, over decades. We're about to watch that happen to one specific woman, in one specific building, across 68 years. But first, we need to get through the door that made it possible. The word hysteria comes from the Greek for uterus. That isn't a coincidence, it's the argument. From the ancient world onward, there was a belief, sometimes explicit, sometimes buried so deeply in medicine that no one thought to examine it, that the female body was fundamentally unstable. The womb in Hippocratic theory could move. It wandered through the body, pressing against other organs, causing blockages, producing fits, triggering emotional storms. A woman was, at a biological level, imagined as a vessel with a wayward element inside it. The uterus became the explanation for her particular unreliability. This idea was medically wrong in every detail. It persisted for over 2,000 years. By the Victorian era, hysteria had become the diagnosis that could explain nearly everything about women that men found inconvenient. Seizures, paralysis, fainting, weeping, rage, desire, refusal of sexual duty, excessive sexual demand, ambition, the desire to write or think or be heard, grief that lasted longer than seemed appropriate, opinions expressed with too much confidence. Almost any of these could become a symptom. The diagnosis was large enough to contain almost anything a woman might do that disrupted male expectations. Victorian Britain had a very clear idea of what a woman was supposed to be: domestic, deferential, emotionally contained in ways that were pleasing and supportive, sexually available to her husband and completely unavailable to anyone else, intellectually limited, or at least good at performing limitation, free of ambition for the public world, and above all, calm, cheerful, manageable. A woman who was none of these things, or who could not sustain the performance, could be sent to her room, or to a doctor, or to an institution. Her husband made the decision. Her husband's word in many legal systems was sufficient evidence. No further test was required. The patient had a husband who said she was unwell. The doctor, male, accepted the account. The woman was committed. Who benefited from calling her wrong? Not the woman herself, not her potential, as a thinker, a writer, a person with her own life to live. The benefit landed on the people around her who found her difficult. The husband who wanted obedience and got resistance. The family that wanted conformity and got individuality. The system that wanted quiet and got someone who refused to be quiet. Hysteria was not only the name of a disease, it was the name of a conflict between what women were being asked to be and what they actually were. And medicine, in that moment, took sides. The anger was real. The grief was real. The desire and the refusal and the intelligence were real. None of it was imaginary. What was imaginary was the clinical explanation for why it was wrong. A woman buries her grief under the floor of her life and lives on top of it. A man diagnoses the floor as unstable. Elizabeth Packard was 44 years old in 1860, when her husband had her committed to a state asylum in Illinois. She was not suffering from a breakdown. She was not a danger to herself or anyone around her. She disagreed with her husband about theology. She said so, clearly, in public, at the church where he ministered. She had opinions. She expressed them. She would not, when asked to stop, stop. Under Illinois law at the time, a husband could commit his wife to a psychiatric institution without a trial and without any medical examination. His declaration that she was insane was sufficient. The law provided no mechanism for her to contest it. The institution held her for 3 years. She argued with her husband. She was imprisoned for it. The system that imprisoned her called itself medicine. Inside the asylum, Elizabeth Packard did what she had always done. She wrote. She organized the other women. She argued with the staff. She kept records. When she was finally released, through a legal proceeding she had to fight for, she took her records with her and spent years campaigning for reform of the laws that had imprisoned her. She won. Several states changed their commitment laws because of her work, but she is one woman. She is the one who had the intelligence, the energy, the support, and the extraordinarily rare combination of circumstances to get out and be heard afterward. Behind her, in every asylum of that era, were women who did not get out. Women whose names are not remembered. Women whose records were written by the people who confined them. Charlotte Perkins Gilman imagined one of those women in a short story she published in 1892. The Yellow Wallpaper runs to fewer than 20 pages. It is one of the most claustrophobic documents in the English language. A woman has been brought by her physician husband to a rented house in the country to recover from what he calls a nervous condition. The treatment is rest, total, absolute, enforced rest. She must not write, must not think about her work, must stay in a large upstairs room with barred windows and peeling yellow wallpaper and do nothing, be nothing, want nothing, say nothing. The room smells stale. The paper is torn at the corners and stained in patterns she can't stop looking at. The windows are barred, for a child's room, her husband explains, as if that makes it neutral. The bed is nailed to the floor. Her husband is a doctor. He's rational, kind, utterly certain, and completely wrong. She's not to exert herself even by questioning his certainty. When she tries to tell him how she feels, he calls her worries silly fancies. When she says the treatment isn't helping, he pats her hand. He knows better. In this arrangement, even love becomes a form of override. Her own experience of herself, gently and completely replaced by his interpretation of her. She writes, in secret, in the margins of things. She begins to see a woman in the pattern of the wallpaper, creeping behind the bars of the pattern, trying to get out. The story was drawn from Gilman's own experience. Her own physician gave her the same prescription: complete rest, no intellectual activity. Go home and be a wife and mother and stop trying to be more than that. Gilman refused the prescription and wrote her way out. The story is about the women who weren't that lucky. What Gilman put on the page was not madness. It was the shape madness takes when it's administered from the outside in. A woman is told calmly and consistently, by an authority she cannot legally challenge, that her own experience of herself is wrong, that her desires are symptoms, that her intelligence is liability, that rest will cure her, where rest means stop being yourself. The cure and the illness are the same thing. The room is the disease. The woman in the wallpaper is trying to get out. She is every woman who ever looked at the architecture of her life, the house, the room, the bed, the husband, the diagnosis, the treatment plan, and understood that the structure itself was the problem. What was being treated was not her mind, but her refusal. The prescription was not health, but compliance. Germany, 1925. A young woman, 20 years old, is admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Gütersloh. She's been placed there by her family, adopted parents who, after the death of her adoptive father, no longer want her. She's described in the intake notes as rebellious, strong-willed, unwilling to conform. In 1925, that is enough. At first, she writes letters, long, insistent letters, to her parents, to anyone she thinks might listen. In one of them, a letter that survived and was found decades later by a psychiatrist going through old files, she writes this: "Dearest mother and father, I miss you so much. I hope you will come to visit me. When will you take me home? They treat me like a dog here. You're Elizabeth. They treat me like a dog here." The years pass. The parents don't come. The letters eventually stop. The notes in her file accumulate. Changes of staff, changes of doctors, each new clinician inheriting the previous one's interpretation, none of them spending enough time with Elizabeth to form an independent one. She refuses food. She becomes aggressive. She is subjected to the standard treatments of the era. Electroshock therapy, administered repeatedly, without consent, without evident benefit. It doesn't help. The notes record that it doesn't help. They administer it again. By the 1960s, Elizabeth has been in the clinic for 35 years. In the notes from that period, something has changed that feels worse than anything the electroshock could have done. The notes no longer record that she says she's treated like a dog. They record that she barks like one. She eats from bowls on the floor. She moves on all fours. What had been a metaphor, her protest, a young woman telling her parents she was being degraded, had, over 3.5 decades, become a behaviour. The institution had offered her one identity with enough persistence that she eventually wore it. Not because she was broken at the start, because she was human, and humans need to be reflected, and for 35 years the only reflection available to her was the one the institution held up. She died in Gütersloh in 1993. She was 88 years old. She had spent 68 years inside the building. The psychiatrist who found the letter afterward, after her death, in the archive, found "They treat me like a dog," and then found the notes from decades later. The clinic had taken a metaphor, turned it into a diagnosis, and the diagnosis into the life. This is not what care looks like. This is what happens when an institution is organised around its own need to process and contain, rather than around the person it claims to hold. The problem was never care itself. The problem is care when it becomes possession, when it stops being for the person inside the room and starts being for the convenience of everyone outside it. 2 more rooms, 2 more women, 2 different stories, arriving at almost the same place. Psychiatry entered Janet Frame's life when she was still very young. By young adulthood, she would spend years inside psychiatric institutions in New Zealand, admitted, discharged, readmitted, treated with what was available, which meant electroshock therapy and the experimental procedures that mid-20th century institutions felt entitled to apply to their residents. Psychiatric residents had fewer rights than most. The logic was benevolent. We know best. The result was damage measured in years. She was scheduled for a lobotomy. The procedure had been fashionable for over a decade. It involved surgically severing connections between the frontal lobe, planning, judgment, personality, so much of what makes a person distinctly themselves, and the rest of the brain. It was intended to calm. It did. It also destroyed. Then, just before the operation, news arrived that her first book, The Lagoon and Other Stories, had won a major literary prize. The file on the patient suddenly had to make room for another fact. She was a writer. The lobotomy was cancelled. She went on to become one of the most significant writers New Zealand has produced. Her autobiography would later be made into a film. She survived to write about what had been done to her. Most people in her situation did not. Not her genius, not her eventual recognition. The arithmetic is what matters here. How many notebooks were not found? How many people in rooms like hers had no one who happened to open a drawer on the right day? How many lobotomies went ahead as planned? The question is not how Janet Frame was spared. The question is how many were not. Zelda Fitzgerald's story is different in its surfaces and identical in its structure. She was brilliant, funny, difficult, and alive in ways that made people around her uncomfortable. She grew up in the American South, educated into the ornamental version of womanhood the early 20th century required, and felt the constraint almost immediately. She and F. Scott Fitzgerald were drawn to each other partly because of that aliveness, her energy, her wit, her way of overflowing the expected. And the marriage became, over time, a slow contest over who that aliveness belonged to. She wrote. Material from her diary and her life moved into his published work, sometimes with only the thinnest disguise. When she later tried to publish her own novel, a work she'd developed over years, she was told it couldn't appear. It would conflict with his. His career was the career. Hers was an intrusion into it. The literary establishment of the era, built by men and largely for men, treated this as a matter of course rather than a scandal. When Zelda was in crisis, genuinely at times and by the later years of her life severely, she was committed to psychiatric care. Some of the treatment she received carried the older moral logic of therapy as correction. In cases like hers, treatment could function less as healing than re-education. The patient was taught, under clinical authority, what a correct woman looked like. At home, patient, supportive, non-disruptive, present to the needs of others. The therapy's goal was not her flourishing, it was her legibility, her manageability, her silence. They were teaching her under clinical authority to disappear. A pattern keeps surfacing in this period, case after case, until it becomes impossible to read it as coincidence. When a man was difficult, restless, drinking too much, conducting affairs, overwhelmed, furious, chaotic, brilliant, he was an artist. His disorder was evidence of depth. It made him interesting, romantic with a capital R, worth writing about and writing around. When a woman did the same things in comparable measure, she was hysterical, unstable, a burden, a patient. The same fire that was romantic in him was pathological in her. The same fire, a different verdict. The husband of record, the doctor's signature, the institution's door, the room, the woman inside. This is how the devil came back, without horns, without anything as obvious as demonic possession. In a white coat now, with a clipboard, with the polite, careful, socially authorized language of care, with a diagnosis that carried legal weight, social legitimacy, and absolute power over the person it named. The witch had been burned in the open as a public warning. The hysteric was put away quietly in a private room, door locked from the outside for her own good. The devil didn't vanish at the end of the Middle Ages. He modernized. He became the husband's signature on the commitment order, the intake form, the treatment plan that no one thought to ask the patient to approve. He got very good at looking like help. That is what makes it hard to see even now. The people doing it mostly believed they were helping. Elizabeth Packard's husband genuinely thought she was unwell. The doctors treating Zelda thought the therapy was therapeutic. The staff at Gütersloh did not gather in a room and agree to turn a woman into an animal. They simply stopped looking at her as one. That's what institutional cruelty requires. Almost no malice at all. It runs on indifference, on paperwork, on the quiet daily assumption that the person in the file is the same as the file. You don't need monsters. You need locked doors and a bureaucracy and the small decision, repeated every morning, not to look too carefully. The women in these stories all had something in common. Each of them, at some point, said or did something the system couldn't accommodate. They argued, they wrote, they refused, they wanted. And the system, with great calm and great efficiency, converted the wanting into a symptom, and the symptom into a room. That conversion, desire into disorder, refusal into pathology, inconvenience into illness, is not a relic of the past. It is the logic. It doesn't require the costume of a witch trial or the explicit misogyny of a Victorian commitment ward to function. It only requires an authority powerful enough to name, and a person without sufficient protection against being named. The costume keeps changing. That's the only thing that changes. From demon to witch hunter, from witch hunter to husband, from husband to asylum doctor. The next version doesn't wear any of those faces. It's quieter, more bureaucratic, more likely to use words like productivity, functionality, compliance, and normal range. It has a waiting room with chairs and a form you fill out before you're seen. The logic enters the school, the office, the performance review, the HR file, the insurance code. The diagnostic manual updated every decade to decide what counts as a disorder and what doesn't, and who sits on the committee that decides. The walls are different, they're cleaner. Sometimes they're made of glass and open plan and you can see everyone around you all day long. The door still locks from the outside, And the question that this film has been asking since the first frame, who benefits from calling her wrong, is still in that room, waiting for an honest answer. The room is different now. No locked ward, no peeling wallpaper, no bars on the windows. The walls are white and clean. The chairs in the waiting area are upholstered in a tasteful neutral colour. There are magazines on the low table, though nobody reads them. The lighting is even and fluorescent and doesn't flicker. Through the glass door you can see a reception desk, a badge scanner, a form on a clipboard. The form asks how often, over the last 2 weeks, you have felt unlike yourself. This is the room we are in now. The old logic that once moved through priests and exorcists and husbands' signatures and asylum intake forms has modernised, because old logics usually do. It wears newer clothes. It speaks a different language. Functionality, evidence-based care, treatment plans, outcomes, recovery timelines, return-to-work assessments. Sometimes this is exactly what it claims to be. Psychiatry can save lives. Medication can return a person to themselves. Therapy can hand someone back their own agency, genuinely, visibly, in ways that matter. Sometimes a diagnosis is the first accurate thing anyone has ever said to a person about their own experience. And that accuracy is a kind of mercy. None of that is being taken away here. Real suffering exists. Real need exists. Real care exists. But care is not a neutral word. A history like this should make us suspicious of any institution that claims to be helping while never asking who, exactly, benefits from the help. When a person enters treatment and emerges quieter, more manageable, better able to show up on time and sit through meetings and answer emails and perform the small daily expectations of a functioning adult, has something been healed? Or has something been adjusted? Both can look identical from the outside. Both can look like a person becoming less difficult to be around. The old institutions wanted women quiet in rooms. The modern world often wants people quiet in meetings. The vocabulary has changed entirely. The question underneath it, who benefits from this person becoming easier to manage, has not changed at all. This doesn't mean every therapeutic intervention is social control. That's too easy and false. It means that every system of care operates inside a larger set of values about what a person is supposed to be able to do and be. Those values are not neutral. They're shaped by economics, by class, by gender, by whatever the surrounding society calls functional, productive, and normal. When care never examines those values, it can end up serving the system more faithfully than the person. Are we helping this person suffer less? Or are we helping the system be less disturbed by them? Are we restoring their agency, or restoring their usefulness? Are we asking what kind of life they want to live, or only whether they can function again inside the life they already have? The difference between healing and compliance is not always visible from the outside. Both can make a person quieter. So the question has to be asked from closer in. What does the person inside the room actually want? What would help them live? And are we willing to listen when the answer is inconvenient? The modern world is not always good at that part. Imagine a very thick book. It has been revised several times. Each revision comes out of committee meetings, literature reviews, votes, political negotiation, pharmaceutical influence, advocacy pressure, insurance requirements, and the accumulated clinical experience of thousands of practitioners. It is written in careful, neutral language. It does not claim to know everything. It even acknowledges its own limits, usually in a preface most people never read. This book does what priests, husbands, and asylum intake officers once did differently, in their own languages, with their own authorities. It names. The name it gives you is not just a word. It is a legal and financial and social position. It determines what treatment you can access and what your insurance will cover, which in many systems means whether you get treatment at all. It determines what accommodations you can request at school or at work. It shapes whether your employer sees you as a liability. It affects whether a judge, in a custody hearing, decides you're a fit parent. It determines whether the people around you believe your account of your own experience or reach for another explanation. A diagnosis from this book can open doors. The wrong diagnosis can lock them. No diagnosis at all can leave you pressing your face against the glass, watching other people get help you cannot access, because what you have does not yet have a name anyone has decided to recognize. For many people, a diagnosis is the first time a professional has said, "What you experience has a shape, a pattern, a name." Other people experience it too. There are things that help. For someone who has spent years being told they're lazy, dramatic, difficult, or simply not trying hard enough, being handed a category that says none of those things is a form of recognition so large it can feel physical. I am not broken in a way that is my fault. There is a name for this. But every system of naming also draws borders, and every border creates people just inside it, people just outside it, and people who can be moved across the line depending on the culture, the committee, the era, the insurance billing code, and the needs of the moment. The diagnostic manual does not only describe suffering, it reflects the anxieties of the society that writes it. In 1952, when the first edition appeared, homosexuality appeared in the manual as a pathology. It took until 1973 for that to change, not only because the science changed, because the politics changed too, and because gay activists showed up at the committee meetings and refused to leave. The book that looked like pure medicine was, in that moment, visibly political. It always had been. It just became harder to ignore. The question gets sharper when categories expand. For years, the criteria made space for recent bereavement, treating grief as something that should not automatically be folded into depression. Then that exclusion was removed. Grief that lasted beyond a certain period could now count as depression. Clinicians debated this fiercely. Some argued that drawing a hard line between grief and depression was artificial and clinically meaningless. Others argued that ordinary human sadness was being given a clinical name too quickly, and that the boundary between suffering and illness was being moved in one direction, toward pathology, in ways that could serve markets as much as patients. Who benefits from a broader category? Sometimes the patient who gets access to treatment they need, sometimes the insurance company, which now has a code to bill, sometimes the pharmaceutical company, whose drug now has a larger eligible market, often all three at once, in proportions that are hard to separate cleanly. The more precisely a society defines normal, the more people it can define as abnormal. This is not a conspiracy. It is what classification systems do. You build a category, you fill it, and the boundary of that category is always political as much as clinical. A diagnostic manual can be a map. Maps are useful. But maps are not innocent. They show what the map maker has decided matters, and they leave out what the map maker has decided not to see. The map is not the territory, and the person living in the territory, the person trying to navigate their own suffering with the map you've handed them, has almost never been on the committee that drew it. A name can save a person. A name can also trap a person. The question is, who gives the name, what power comes with it, and whether the name person gets to speak back. Very often they don't. There is a particular kind of human being that the modern economy rewards, not happy necessarily. Plenty of very successful people are not happy, not whole, not free, not especially creative or kind or wise. These things are optional extras. What is required is narrower, punctual, regulated, productive, responsive, measurable, emotionally contained, consistently available. Someone who can perform at roughly the same level, 5 days a week, across multiple decades, without needing too much accommodation, too much time off, too much adaptation from the structures they work inside. This person wakes on time, arrives on time, answers messages within a reasonable window, keeps their face neutral in difficult meetings, recovers from personal losses at an acceptable speed, works through anxiety without making it visible, smiles through exhaustion when the situation requires it, keeps private life from contaminating professional output, does not cry at work, does not express rage at the obvious absurdities of the system, does not ask too often why things are arranged this way, especially when the arrangement benefits those above them and costs those below. This person is called stable, high-functioning, professional, normal, and perhaps they are normal in the statistical sense. They represent something close to the mean of what modern institutional life produces and rewards. But normal in that sense is not the same as healthy. It is not the same as whole. It is not the same as evidence that the arrangement is reasonable. Capitalism does not need you to be well. It needs you to be well enough to work. These are different requirements. A person can be profoundly unwell and still arrive on time. A person can be healthy, imaginative, alive, and completely unable to perform the narrow, historically specific set of behaviours the modern labour market asks of them. The metric is not wellness. The metric is output, and output is then described, after the fact, as evidence of health. This produces a strange little accounting system. The person who can work is fine. The person who cannot is disordered. But what the work is, whether the work is worth doing, and whether the conditions are reasonable for a human body and mind, these questions are not on the form. The form only asks, can you function? And functioning in this context means something very specific. It means functioning inside this system, at this speed, in this room, under these lights, for these hours, toward these goals. The system's design is not on trial. The person is. Modern normal is often just productivity with a softer name. Women have been carrying a particular version of this for a long time. The Victorian woman was required to be calm, cheerful, and manageable in the domestic sphere. The modern woman is required to be calm, cheerful, and manageable everywhere. At work, at home, in email, in meetings, in relationships, in public, online, in the doctor's waiting room, filling out the form that asks how often, in the last 2 weeks, she has felt unlike herself. She's expected to work with the focus of someone who has no body and to care with the warmth of someone who has no competing obligations. When she cannot sustain both at once, when the weight breaks through, she is described not as overburdened but as struggling. The burden is not examined. She is. If she is angry, she is difficult. If she is exhausted, she has poor coping strategies. If she cannot maintain the performance, she is a mental health concern. The system that is exhausting her is not a mental health concern. The system is simply the system. It is normal. Modern capitalism did not abolish the room. It made the room open plan. The door became a calendar. The lock became rent. The diagnosis became not functioning. The logic is the same. It has a glass wall now and excellent coffee. Consider what happens to a child on their first day of school. They arrive and they're given a place, a specific desk in a specific row. There are other desks in other rows, all oriented the same direction, toward the front of the room where an adult stands with authority. The child is told to sit, to stay seated, to raise a hand before speaking, to ask permission before moving, to attend to one thing for a specified period, then to stop attending to that thing and attend to another thing when a bell sounds, not when they are ready. To be quiet in the halls, to eat at the scheduled time, to be available for assessment at intervals that somebody else has decided are appropriate. This is not described as training. It is described as education. But something is being trained, and it is not only the academic content, it is the body. The body is learning when it is permitted to move and when it must be still, when it is permitted to speak and when it must be silent, when its own signals, hunger, fatigue, curiosity, restlessness, the need to get up and do something with its hands are legitimate, and when they must be overridden. The child who learns this well is called well-adjusted. The child who cannot is called a problem. The office is the continuation of the classroom, with different furniture and a salary, chairs, screens, calendars, dress codes that communicate seriousness, which is a particular aesthetic, which is a particular class performance with a history. Small talk performed daily with people you may or may not like, because the performance of easy collegiality is required. Availability tracked through badge scanners and email response times and calendar visibility. Body language surveilled in meetings. Emotional response managed, because expressing the wrong feeling at the wrong moment is a career event. The modern worker has learned to sit through the same number of hours per day that the Victorian factory worker stood through, though in a chair now, with better air conditioning, and the labour is cognitive rather than physical. The body is still being given over, the mind is still being organised around someone else's schedule. The person who cannot do this reliably is described as having difficulty with professional norms. The norms are not described as having difficulty with the person. The direction of the fault-finding matters. When we keep locating the failure inside the individual, in their attention, their mood, their regulation, their executive function, their social skills, we stop asking what the room is doing to them, and the room is not passive. Fluorescent lights do something to bodies that evolved in sunlight. The noise of the open-plan office does something to nervous systems that did not develop in a constant ambient roar. 8 hours of mandated social performance does something to people who need quiet to think, or movement to focus, or privacy to function. Compressing human complexity into 45-minute Zoom blocks and response times under an hour does something to the quality of thought anyone can manage. A system builds one kind of room and then calls every body that cannot endure it abnormal. The child who cannot sit still in rows may flourish in movement, in urgency, in something that uses their hands or their speed or their capacity for intense short-term focus. The adult who cannot manage the fluorescent open plan may work brilliantly in a studio or a lab, or alone at night, or on a problem that genuinely matters to them, or in a crisis where their particular wiring becomes an obvious asset. The person who struggles with 9 to 5 rigidity may be extraordinarily productive in a different rhythm entirely. Most people know this from the inside. The sudden competence that arrives when the task is interesting. The complete inability to move on something meaningless. The way the right environment seems to unlock abilities that the wrong environment buries completely. But modern institutions rarely build from that knowledge. They keep selecting for one kind of nervous system, one kind of attention, one kind of body, and describing everything outside those tolerances as a deficit in the person. A mind that fails in one architecture may flourish in another. That is a true sentence. And we have not built many other architectures. ADHD is not laziness. The accusation of laziness has followed people with ADHD through school, through work, through relationships, through their own internal monologue, for most of their lives. The email sits in the inbox for 3 weeks, unanswered. Not because the person doesn't care, not because they have forgotten it exists. They think about it often with a specific low-grade dread, the way you'd think about a phone call you need to make that you keep not making. The email sits there because initiating it has, for reasons the person cannot fully explain, become impossible in the ordinary sense of the word. And then, on some random Tuesday, they sit down with something else entirely and work for 11 hours straight without looking up, without eating, following a thread of thought so deep and focused that they can barely remember coming to the desk. The same person. Not lazy. A different nervous system, meeting a world that was built around a different one. ADHD is about attention regulation, not attention absence. The difficulty is not caring. It is directing focus voluntarily, while the nervous system is also searching for stimulation, novelty, urgency, passion, or the pressure of a deadline that has not arrived yet. That nervous system may not be well suited to the task-switching, routine-maintaining demands of most modern institutions, but that does not make it broken. It makes it differently shaped. The world was not built for that shape. The fluorescent classroom, the rows of desks, the expectation that all children, regardless of neurological wiring, should be able to sit still, attend in the same direction, and produce consistent output across a standardized schedule. These are not natural conditions, they are design choices, and design choices have consequences for bodies and minds that were not the model when the choices were made. Autism, too, is not primarily a deficit. It is a different experience of the world, of sensation, communication, social interaction, routine, intensity, detail. In the meeting, the person at the end of the table is not making eye contact. Someone reads this as disengagement or rudeness, or not taking the conversation seriously. But they may be listening more carefully than anyone else in the room. Eye contact for them is not proof of attention. It is competing demand on attention, something that takes processing away from listening. The person who meets your eyes and nods may have learned to perform listening. This person is listening. They may need the same route home every day, the same desk in the same corner, the same order of operations in the morning. Not because they are rigid, but because unpredictability costs energy other people get to spend on work. They may speak more directly than feel socially smooth, not because they are insensitive, but because they are reading the content of what's said, rather than the layers of implication around it. They may withdraw from the team lunch not because they dislike their colleagues, but because the restaurant is loud, the seating is unpredictable, the social rules are unspoken and shifting, and navigating all of it will leave them unable to think for the rest of the afternoon. These are not failures of personality. They are differences in perception and processing that become disabling specifically in the collision with a world designed around different assumptions. Sensory sensitivity is real, and the modern world is not quiet. The open plan office that one person barely notices, the ambient murmur, the overlapping conversations, the random interruptions, the phones, the notifications, the fluorescent flicker, is, for another person, something closer to a continuous assault. Not dramatic, not performed, simply true. Same environment. Two different experiences of it. One person completes a full day's work, the other spends a significant portion of their cognitive capacity trying to survive the noise instead of doing the thing they came to do. Both leave the building. Only one of them is described as having a problem. Neurodivergence is not always suffering. Very often the suffering begins when the world demands constant translation, when a person has to spend serious energy every day converting themselves into a version the environment can process, leaving little energy for the actual work of living. Accommodations are not special favours. They are evidence that the original design was not universal. When a building has stairs and no ramp, the ramp is not a privilege for the person in the wheelchair. It is an acknowledgement that the building was built without them in mind. When a workplace requires attendance at a specific time in a specific place under specific lighting conditions, and someone cannot meet those requirements because of how their nervous system works, the accommodation is not charity. It is the correction of an oversight. Capitalism has a particular relationship with neurodivergence. It loves certain neurodivergent gifts when they produce value. The hyper-focus that works through the night on a technical problem, the pattern recognition that sees what others miss, the intensity that drives creative obsession, the precision that catches every error, the unconventional thinking that produces the solution nobody else considered. These gifts are celebrated, monetized, mythologized in the biographies of tech founders and artists and scientists who are retrospectively diagnosed with admiration. But the same capitalism that loves these gifts is uninterested in the nervous system that carries them. It does not want to accommodate the rest requirements, the irregular rhythms, the sensory limits, the communication differences, the recovery time, the need for autonomy and self-direction, the inability to perform constant availability. It wants the output without the person. It wants the gift unwrapped from the body it lives in. The system wants the gift without the nervous system that carries it. And when the person cannot separate these things, because they cannot, because they are one thing, because you cannot have the hyper-focus without the rest, the pattern recognition without the overwhelm, the intensity without the cost, the system says, you're not functioning well enough. The person gets the label. The system keeps the design. The difficulty is real. Some neurodivergent people suffer significantly, and they need care, accommodation, and genuine support. None of this argues otherwise. But the difficulty is not always located where we're told it is. Often it lives in the collision between a nervous system and a world that was never built to accommodate it. That collision is being called a disorder. The system burns people through. This is not a metaphor. It is an observable process with a name, burnout, described in clinical literature since the 1970s and recognized by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon. It means exhaustion so deep that ordinary tasks become impossible, detachment from work and from people, a loss of the feeling that anything matters or will improve. It usually arrives after a long period of giving more than was returned, of performing availability that was not reciprocated, of working in conditions no human body can sustain indefinitely without enough rest, meaning, or recognition. When a person in this condition appears in a waiting room and fills out the form asking how often, in the last 2 weeks, they have felt unlike themselves, the form does not ask, unlike yourself because of what? Unlike yourself because your employer has taken 3 years from your capacity and given back a salary and a performance review. Unlike yourself because you have been asked to be endlessly available to a system that does not consider your availability a sacrifice. Unlike yourself because the world outside is increasingly precarious and frightening, and the anxiety you carry about it may be a sane response to something genuinely alarming. The form does not ask these things. The form asks you to rate your symptoms on a scale and returns a score, and the treatment that follows is often aimed at making you functional again. Functional in the same conditions that produced the problem. Functional enough to return. This is not always wrong. Sometimes returning to work is what a person needs. Sometimes the conditions have genuinely improved. Sometimes medication restores enough equilibrium for a person to access their own capacity for change. Care is not simple, and the good it does is real. But care that only adjusts the person to the source of harm, without examining the source of harm, is incomplete at best. At worst, it serves the system causing the damage and calls that treatment. The system exhausts people, then asks why they're tired. Grief is another place where the logic becomes visible. Grief has a preferred timeline in modern institutions. There is bereavement leave, a number of days considered sufficient. There are expectations, usually unspoken but clearly felt, about when visible sadness should become private sadness, when private sadness should become managed sadness, when managed sadness should become functional sadness, and when functional sadness should become effective performance of happiness during working hours. The person who cannot move through these stages fast enough becomes a concern. Their grief has lasted longer than the institution can accommodate. They may need help. What kind of help? Help returning to the schedule, help getting back to output, help becoming, once again, professionally available. Anger is another signal the system does not know what to do with. Anger at the conditions of one's work. Anger at the conditions of one's gender, or race, or class. Anger at a specific and obvious injustice that the people with power to change it refuse to acknowledge. This anger is described clinically as dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation is a symptom. The appropriate response is to learn to regulate, to manage the anger, to reduce its intensity and expression, to make it less inconvenient for the people around you. Sometimes this is right. Sometimes anger is genuinely destructive, and the person needs help understanding its sources. But sometimes the anger is accurate. Sometimes it is the most lucid thing the person is producing. Sometimes the anger is seeing clearly in a situation that requires the people around it to look away. Teaching that person to modulate their anger, to be less disruptive, to stop naming the thing so loudly, that is not always therapy. Sometimes it is the system defending itself against the one person in the room telling the truth about it. The gender line comes back here because it never really left. A man who speaks with force in a meeting is direct. A woman who does the same is aggressive. A man who expresses frustration when things go wrong is under pressure. A woman who does the same is emotional. A man who raises his voice because the stakes are high is passionate. A woman who raises hers is losing control. The same emotional content, the same volume, roughly, a completely different verdict on what it means and whether the person can be trusted. The Victorian doctors who diagnosed women with hysteria for having opinions expressed with too much confidence did not need particular malice most of the time. They were reading behaviour through the values of their era. The professional culture that today describes a woman's anger as dysregulation, as a communication problem, as evidence that she struggles with emotional regulation, does not always need malice either. It is reading behaviour through the values of its own era. The costume changes. The function stays the same. A woman's anger is translated into a symptom. The symptom becomes the story, and the injustice that produced the anger disappears from the narrative entirely. This is not to say all anger is justified, or all conflict is oppression. It is to say that anger can be an accurate response to an unjust arrangement. And a system that consistently interprets women's anger as evidence of instability, rather than evidence of a grievance, is not performing neutral clinical care. It is taking a political position with clinical language. Sometimes the symptom is not proof that the person is broken. Sometimes it is proof that the person is still responding. This is not an argument that suffering is always political, not an argument that no one needs help, not an argument that medication, therapy and diagnosis are oppression. For many people, they are lifelines. But help that stops at the person, that asks only how to adjust, regulate, medicate, manage and return them to function, is missing something. It is missing the question of what the person is being returned to, and whether that return serves them or the system that called them a problem. Some people adapted to the modern room, some broke inside it, some were medicated so they could keep going, some were diagnosed so their difficulty had a category, Some were fired because the category didn't protect them. Some were called difficult. Some were called unstable. Some were called too sensitive, too emotional, too much, not enough, not right. Some were called mad. But some of the people called mad were not wrong. Some saw something too clearly. Some felt something too fully. Some refused too early, when everyone around them was still pretending the arrangement was reasonable. Some would not perform normality convincingly enough for an audience that needed the performance to continue. Part 4 will find them: the melancholic, the visionary, the difficult, the creative, the inconvenient, the genius, the prophet, the artist, the person who looked at the room and said, out loud, that the room was wrong. The modern room is clean. The light is bright and even. The forms are filled out and filed. The person has been named and assigned a category and handed a plan. And the old question is still sitting on the table. Who said she was wrong? And what did they need her wrongness to conceal? For a long stretch of history, sadness was not treated as simple failure. Not automatically. Not as a deficiency. Not as a chemical state to be corrected as quickly as possible. In the Renaissance, a particular kind of heavy, brooding, contemplative sadness, melancholy, could be understood as the mark of a deep mind, the scholar's affliction, the artist's weather, the price, and sometimes the source, of genius. The idea ran straight back to the 4 humours. Too much black bile pulled a person down into the heavy, slow inward state the Greeks had named melancholia. And somewhere along the way, that state stopped being purely a problem. People began to notice that the melancholic temperament showed up, again and again, in the thinkers, the writers, the makers, the ones who saw further than everyone around them. The sadness and the depth seemed to travel together. So melancholy became, for a while, almost a credential. A sign that you were the kind of person who felt the weight of things, who looked into them rather than past them. Picture the figure that whole era half admired and half feared. A scholar at a desk in the late afternoon, the light going gold and then grey, books open and unread in front of him, his chin in his hand, staring at nothing. Not working, not sleeping, somewhere else entirely, turning something over in the slow work of a mind that won't let a question rest. The Renaissance looked at that figure and did not immediately reach for a cure. It reached sometimes for reverence. The heaviness was understood as a toll a person paid for depth, and the toll, however painful, was thought to buy something real. That is where one of our most durable clichés begins: the tortured artist. The thin line between genius and madness. The idea that real depth requires real suffering, that the people who see the world most clearly are the ones it wounds most deeply. We should be careful here, because that cliché has done real harm. It has romanticized genuine illness. It has told suffering people that their pain is the price of their gift, that to treat it would be to lose themselves, that they should stay in the dark because the dark is where the good work comes from. That is a lie, and it has cost lives. We are not repeating it. Strip away the romance, though, and something true remains. There have always been states of mind that a culture cannot decide what to do with, states that hover between affliction and insight, between symptom and perception, and what a society does with those in-between states, whether it reveres them or medicates them, whether it gives them a temple or a ward, tells you almost nothing about the states themselves and almost everything about the society. The brooding genius cliché leaves out the part that matters most. Society only forgives melancholy when it produces something society wants. The melancholy of a great male poet is depth. The melancholy of a celebrated philosopher is profundity. We build courses around it. We write biographies that treat the suffering as the engine of the work. The melancholy of a woman is hysteria. The melancholy of a poor person is a failure to cope. The melancholy of a worker is a productivity problem, an absenteeism risk, a line item. The melancholy of a difficult, unproductive, inconvenient person who never produces a famous painting or a famous book is just madness, and gets treated as madness and is filed away under madness with no biography to redeem it. The same inner weather, sorted entirely by who is carrying it and whether the world ever got anything out of their pain. The state was never the thing being judged. The person was, and the verdict was handed down according to their usefulness. Almost everyone recognizes something in that arithmetic. We have all had pain that was received, held, taken seriously, and pain that was waved off, filed away, treated as an inconvenience to the people around us. The difference, more often than we admit, had nothing to do with the pain itself. It had to do with who was carrying it and whether the world had any use for them. Some people arrive slightly out of step with their own time. They speak a language the present cannot quite pass. They notice that the arrangement everyone else has agreed to treat as permanent is neither permanent nor reasonable. They feel things at an intensity the culture has no container for. And when a culture has no container, it reaches for the oldest one it has. It calls them mad. We know a few of their names because a few of them were eventually vindicated, which is another way of saying that history decided too late that they had been useful after all. The painter dismissed as unstable, selling almost nothing in his life, whose work now hangs behind climate-controlled glass insured for sums that would have rebuilt his entire short life many times over. The philosopher whose ideas took a century to become legible, collapsing into a long silence before anyone caught up to him. There is a specific cruelty in that arithmetic. The world that could not make room for these people while they lived now charges admission to stand near what they left behind. It called them mad while their vision cost it nothing to ignore, and called them geniuses once that vision could be sold. But the famous names are almost a distraction. They are survivorship bias wearing a halo. The handful whose vision happened to become legible later, whose paintings happened to be kept, whose prizes happened to arrive in time, like Janet Frames before the lobotomy. For every one of them, there were thousands who saw just as clearly, felt just as deeply, refused just as early, and were simply erased. No gallery, no reappraisal, no plaque, just a name in a ledger written in someone else's hand. So, no. The point is not that the mad are secretly geniuses. That is the tortured artist lie again, wearing a flattering coat, and it has done real harm. Most people called mad were not undiscovered masters waiting to be vindicated, and we betray them by pretending otherwise. A person does not need to be extraordinary to have been wronged. The cult of the misunderstood genius quietly abandons everyone who was not a genius. The ordinary people who are crushed, the ones with no masterpiece to be discovered, no posthumous exhibition, no second act, were wronged exactly as badly. More badly often, because there was no eventual fame to launder the injustice into a tragic origin story. They were just hurt and then forgotten, and there is no painting to redeem them. That should trouble us far more than it does. The measure of the wrong was never the talent of the person it was done to. The harder point is quieter. Some of the people a society calls mad have not lost contact with reality. They have lost their willingness to pretend. There is a kind of sanity that consists almost entirely of agreement, of nodding along, of treating the local arrangement, whatever it happens to be, in whatever century, as natural, inevitable, simply the way things are. And there have always been people who could not, or would not, perform that agreement, who looked at the witch trial and saw murder, who looked at the asylum and saw a prison, who looked at the marriage and saw ownership, who looked at the factory and saw bodies being used up, who looked at whatever everyone else was calling normal and felt, in their gut, that something was wrong with it, to a society built on the agreement that refusal looks like illness. It has to. The alternative, that the refuser is seeing accurately on Mystelm, is unbearable, because it implicates everyone who agreed. That refusal is dangerous in any era. Not violence, not chaos, refusal. The quiet, unshakable refusal to call the arrangement normal, and the most efficient way to neutralize that refusal has never been to argue with it. It has been to reclassify it, to move it out of the category of dissent and into the category of disorder. Because a dissenter has to be answered. A mad woman can simply be managed. Now comes the quiet part, the one the whole film has been walking toward. Most of the systems we've travelled through, the church courts, the asylums, the diagnostic committees, the institutions of medicine and law and work, were built by men, built around male experience, male assumptions, male comfort, treated as the neutral default, not because the men who built them were uniquely cruel, most of them weren't, but because they built a world to their own measurements and then called those measurements universal. What it produced was a double standard so consistent across so many centuries that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like design. Male anger is authority. Female anger is instability. A man who shouts is commanding. A woman who shouts is hysterical. Male obsession is dedication, the single-minded focus of the great man. Female obsession is pathology, something to be medicated. Male appetite is drive. Female appetite is disorder. Male solitude is the noble isolation of the thinker. Female solitude is the sad spinster, the crazy woman with her cats, the one who failed at the only job that mattered. Male desire is nature. Female desire was, for most of recorded history, a symptom. A man who breaks the rules is a maverick. A woman who breaks the same rules is broken. Watch the same act split in two as it crosses the line between him and her. He is decisive. She is controlling. He is principled. She is rigid. He is ambitious. She is calculating. He is a perfectionist. She is neurotic. He is passionate. She is too emotional. He is a visionary. She is delusional. Not different behaviours. The same behaviours. Read through a lens ground to flatter one of them and pathologise the other. And the deepest one, the one underneath all the others. A man's greatness was assumed to be his own, while a woman's greatness was assumed to belong to the man nearest her. Her labour supported his genius. Her silence made room for his voice. Her diary became his material. When she tried to claim her own work, her own anger, her own life, the system that had relied on her invisibility had a word ready. Mediocre systems can sound like a slogan, so be precise about the phrase. It is more interesting than a slogan. A mediocre system is not a system run by stupid people. It is a system organised to reward manageability over excellence. It selects for the people who fit its existing shape and filters out the people who would force it to change. And the people who would force it to change, the genuinely original, the genuinely intense, the ones who see the thing nobody else sees, are exactly the people such a system experiences as a threat. Real excellence is disruptive. It exposes the arbitrariness of the existing standard. It reveals that the ruler everyone has been measured against was never the only possible ruler, and a system built on that ruler cannot afford to admit it. So it does not reward its most extraordinary people. It manages them. It files down the ones who are too bright. It silences the ones who are too sensitive. It medicates the ones who are too intense. It pathologizes the ones who are too free. And it calls all of this, with a straight face, normal. Mediocre systems fear exceptional people, because exceptional people reveal how narrow the system was built. That is the engine underneath the history of madness as a social label. not a conspiracy of evil men. Something more ordinary and more durable than that. Arrangements built by the comfortable, calibrated to the comfortable, that experience anyone too different, too brilliant, too sensitive, too angry, too unwilling, as a malfunction to be corrected rather than a signal to be heard. What patriarchy feared was never that women were irrational. It was the opposite. It was that women were rational and might notice, might look at the arrangement and decline to call it normal, might withdraw the agreement the whole structure depended on. Read the historical record closely, and you can almost feel the fear underneath the diagnoses. The woman who reads too much, the woman who asks why, the woman who does not need to be told what she thinks. There is a reason so much energy across so many centuries went into keeping women uneducated, unpropertied, unable to leave, unable to earn, unable to be believed. And a reason that the moment any of those walls cracked, a medical language was waiting to explain why the women climbing through them were unwell. The control was not incidental to the care. In those cases, the control was the care. A woman who needs no man's permission to trust her own mind is not a medical problem. But to a system built on her requiring that permission, she has always looked like one. Now take apart the word this entire film has been circling. Normal. It feels solid. It feels like it describes something real, a baseline, a standard, a way most people simply are, against which difference can be measured. But hold it up to the light and it dissolves in your hands. Normal began as a statistical idea. It means close to the average, the middle of the distribution, the most common value. That is all it ever meant mathematically, and there is nothing wrong with the math. The average human height is a fact. The average response to a medication is a useful thing to know. Somewhere along the way we did something illegitimate with the word. We slid it from describing what is common to prescribing what is good. We turned a measurement into a moral standard. Normal stopped meaning typical and started meaning correct, healthy, acceptable, the way a person is supposed to be. That slide is the trick. The average is not an ideal. It never was. The average is just the middle of whatever happens to be there. In a society organized around productivity, the average bends toward productivity. In a society organized around obedience, the average bends toward obedience. Normal is not a fixed star you can navigate by. It is a mirror held up to whatever a particular society already rewards, and then handed back to you as though it were a law of nature. Look at what the word has swallowed. A child who cannot sit in rows is abnormal, in a system that decided rows were natural. A woman who wants her own life is abnormal, in a system that decided her life belonged to someone else. A worker who cannot perform constant availability is abnormal, in a system that decided human beings should be available like machines. A grieving person who grieves too long is abnormal, in a system that allotted grief a specific number of days. A mind that processes the world differently is abnormal, in a system that built one room and one set of lights and one rhythm and called everything else a disorder. In every single case, the abnormality was located in the person, and in every single case, the actual variable was the system. Now the word doing the quietest work steps into the light. For 4 parts, we have been watching the word mad do its terrible work, burning women, locking rooms, erasing lives. But mad was only ever the punishment. It was never the law. The law was normal. Mad is the sentence handed down. Normal is the court that hands it down, the statute it is read from, the judge who presumes the right to read it. Mad only has power because normal has been allowed to stand behind it, unexamined, unquestioned, treated not as one possible arrangement among many, but as nature itself, as health itself, as the simple, obvious truth about how a person ought to be. You cannot call someone mad until you have first convinced everyone, including the accused, that there is a normal she has fallen away from. The accusation depends entirely on the standard. Remove the standard and the accusation has nothing to stand on. The most dangerous word in this history is not the one that did the visible damage. It is the quiet one, the reasonable one, the one nobody thought to interrogate, because it disguised itself as the absence of any position at all. There is no normal person. There is only the person who happens to fit the room they were born into, well enough for now. Change the room, and you change who counts as normal. Change the century and the whole population of the mad gets reshuffled. The witch becomes the healer. The hysteric becomes the woman with opinions. The melancholic becomes the depressive, becomes perhaps simply someone going through something hard. The disordered child becomes, in the right environment, the most alive person in it. There is a vertigo in that, if you let yourself feel it. Every one of us has at some point sat in a room where we were the wrong shape. Too quiet, too loud, too slow, too strange, too much, and felt the particular shame of not fitting. And almost none of us stopped to wonder whether the shame belonged to the room. We assumed it was ours. We always assume it is ours. That assumption is the most successful thing the word normal ever did. The word works hardest to hide one more thing. Many of the people who appear normal are not well. They are simply paying the cost privately. Some fit because the room genuinely suits them. They were lucky in the match between their nature and the structure they landed in. But many others only appear to fit because they have learned to bleed quietly, to swallow the panic before the meeting, to perform an ease they do not feel, to go home emptied out and say nothing, and arrive the next morning composed and call it coping. This has a name now, for the people who do it most consciously: masking. The neurodivergent person who spends enormous daily energy imitating the social reflexes that come automatically to others, the eye contact, the small talk, the modulated tone, and collapses in private from the effort. But masking is not only a neurodivergent experience. It is the woman who has learned that her anger must be filed down to a pleasant smoothness before it can be spoken, if it can be spoken at all. It is the worker who has learned that exhaustion must never show, that fear must be hidden, that the only acceptable face is the available one. The performance of normality is itself a labour, and it is not distributed evenly. Some are born already fitting the room. Others spend their lives manufacturing the appearance of a fit at a cost no one around them ever sees. So a room full of normal people is not a room full of well people. It is a room of those who fit, sitting beside those who have learned to hide how much it cost them not to. The second group is invisible by design. Their whole achievement is that you cannot see the wound, and we take that silent, expensive performance and hold it up as proof that the room is reasonable, since most people manage, the ones who cannot must be the problem. Normal is not health. Normal is not truth. Normal is not even a fact about people. It is a fact about the fit between a person and an arrangement. And the arrangement was built by someone for some purpose that almost never had the person's flourishing at its centre. To be normal is, very often, just to be shaped conveniently for a structure you did not design and were never asked to consent to. Once you see that clearly, the word loses some of its power to wound. There was never a normal person standing behind it, judging you. There was a room and a measurement, and a long history of people mistaking the measurement for the truth. Before the film says the last thing it has to say, it needs to return to the line it has held the entire time, not as a disclaimer, as the moral spine of the argument. Everything we have said collapses into cruelty if it is misread as this: that mental illness is a fiction, that no one is ever really ill, that all care is control and all medicine is oppression. That is not what this film believes, and it is not what the evidence shows. Severe psychosis is real. The person terrified by voices that will not stop, who can no longer tell the inside of their mind from the world outside it, is suffering and deserves real care, sometimes urgent care. Severe depression is real, and it is not the melancholy of poets. It is a flat, total darkness that has ended countless lives. Mania is real. Crisis is real. The danger a person in genuine crisis can pose to themselves is real. The need for shelter, for medicine, for skilled and patient hands is real. At its best, this work gives people back their own lives. We owe it our respect, and we give it freely. None of that is what this film has been about. This film has been about everything piled on top of that real suffering. The vast territory of difference, refusal, inconvenience, grief, anger, sensitivity, and plain non-conformity that we swept into the same category and handed to the same system, because it was easier to call a person mad than to ask why they would not fit. The women accused as witches were very often not psychotic. They were old, poor, unmarried, knowledgeable, inconvenient, or simply in the way. Elizabeth Packard was not confined because she was dangerous. She disagreed with her husband. Zelda was not reducible to a patient. She was also a talented woman inside a marriage and a literary culture that needed her smaller. The woman in Gütersloh did not start as a person who barked. The neurodivergent child failing in the fluorescent classroom is not broken. The exhausted worker burned through by an inhuman schedule is not, at root, the sickness. These are the people the word was used against, and for them the word was never a diagnosis. It was a verdict. The distinction has to stay sharp, because everything depends on it. The difference between care and control is not the white coat, or the medication, or the building, or the language. The same coat covers both. The difference is what the intervention is willing to be asked. Real care listens. Control processes. Real care begins with the person's own account of their life. Control begins with the form. Real care returns agency. It works to hand a person back to themselves. Control returns function. It hands a person back to the system that found them inconvenient. Real care can be questioned by the very person it claims to help, and survive the question, and even be improved by it. Control cannot survive that question. Control needs the person silent, or compliant, or grateful, or gone. Ask whether, if the person could speak freely and without fear of consequence, they would call what is being done to them help. Care can survive that question. Control cannot. Not a rule you apply from the outside, a direction to face, toward the person. Always back toward the person, the only one who was never on the committee, never held the ruler, never wrote the file, and who is in the end the only one the whole thing was ever supposed to be for. The clinical is real. We set it aside with care and respect precisely so we can see everything that has been hiding behind it. Go back to the street, to where we started. The woman with the coffee she didn't pay for, still there in the flat morning light talking to someone we couldn't see. We never learned her name. We never learned what she was living through. We decided in the first 30 seconds that we didn't need to. Go back to all of them now. The Mesopotamian man 4,000 years ago, certain of a priest behind his shoulder that no one else could see. The Greek who trembled and spoke from somewhere else, and was brought to the oracle instead of the cell. The woman dragged from her village because the harvest failed and she lived alone and somebody needed a reason. Elizabeth Packard, 3 years behind a door because she argued theology with her husband. The woman in the yellow room, watching another woman creep behind the bars of the wallpaper trying to get out. The woman in Gütersloh, who wrote "They treat me like a dog here," and was answered 35 years later with a note that said she barked. Janet Frame, one literary prize away from a lobotomy. Zelda taught under clinical authority how to disappear. The child who couldn't sit in the rows. The worker burned through and then asked why they were tired. The person who felt too much, saw too clearly, refused too early. Every one of them was called mad, or close to it, by someone. Ask the question this film has carried from the beginning. Ask it now, with everything behind it. Who said she was mad? A priest needing a demon to explain the village's fear. A husband needing his wife smaller. A doctor needing a category for a woman who would not be quiet. A father needing an obedient daughter. An institution needing a manageable inmate. An economy needing an interchangeable worker. A school needing a still child. A whole society needing to believe that the problem was always inside the difficult person and never inside the arrangement that found them difficult. And ask the second question, the one part 3 left on the table. What did they need her wrongness to conceal? Their own fear, the arbitrariness of their own rules, the cruelty of their own comfort, the fact that the arrangement they called normal was not natural, not permanent, not just, and that the person they were pointing at had seen this and would not pretend otherwise. Through the asylums, the wallpaper, the locked rooms, the same shape keeps repeating, a person who did not fit, a power that could not tolerate the not fitting, and a word reached for to make the not fitting disappear. From a man in Sumer to a woman on a modern street, the costumes changed. The thread did not. Put it plainly. Setting aside the genuine, severe, clinical suffering we've been careful to honour, the real illness, the real crisis, the real need for care. Madness is not a fact. It is a verdict. It was never mostly a fact about the mind. It was a decision about the order, issued by power and dressed across the centuries in whatever language the era found most unanswerable. Theology, then medicine, then science. The robe changed. The ruling did not. Underneath every version of it sat the same small, brutal question, asked about a human being as though they were a tool. Are you convenient for us? They're only different people. People who were too much, or too little, or too early, or too clear. People power could not use, could not tolerate, and could not bear to simply leave alone. And so it reached for the oldest word it had, and pressed it onto them like a brand, and called the brand a diagnosis. And it could do this only because something else had already been built, quietly, underneath. A normal. A standard treated as natural, moral beyond question. Mad was the punishment. Normal was the law that made the punishment look just. Take away the law, admit that normal was only ever a room someone built, for their own purposes and called the world, and the whole apparatus of madness loses its foundation. The accusation cannot stand once the standard it rests on is seen for what it is. So the real question was never whether these people were mad. The real question was who held the power to say so, and what they were protecting when they did. That is the verdict the film returns. Not a comfort, a correction. The grip that the word normal has held on you, and it has held on all of us, was never earned. It was only ever assumed. So the next time someone calls you too sensitive, too intense, too difficult, too much, do not accept the word before you have inspected the room. Ask who is holding the ruler. Ask what it cost them for you to fit, and what it would cost them if you stopped trying. And consider seriously the possibility that the room was always the stranger thing, stranger by far than the person it could not hold. One more turn, because the responsibility changes hands here. For 4 parts, we have watched other people wield the word. Priests, husbands, doctors, institutions. But the word does not only get used on us, we use it too. On the woman on the street, on the relative who is too much, on the stranger who does not fit. We have all reached for it, because it is easy, because it ends the conversation, because it lets us stop having to understand. Now you know what it does, and knowing it, you cannot use it the same way again. Go back to the street one last time. The light is still flat and ordinary. The woman is still there, finishing her coffee, talking to someone we cannot see. In 30 seconds she will walk on and be gone, and we will never know her name, or what she was carrying, or what she could see that we could not. We decided at the very beginning that we didn't need to know, that we could name her instead. We don't have to do that. Before we name her, we can ask. Before we measure her, we can listen. Before we call her mad, we can examine the room she could not fit inside, and wonder, honestly, who built it, and who it was built to keep out. That is the refusal, not a cure, not an answer to every hard thing the mind can become. A quiet decision to stop doing the oldest thing in this story. The woman finishes her coffee, she walks on, and this time we let her pass without a verdict.